Thank you very much for the organizers. They decided that my small contribution is interesting for this conference. Thank you for all of the speakers. It was very interesting for me to listen to you. So today I will speak about, it's not really part of my project. The thing is that I'm working with testimonies, and suddenly some serious issues struck in me when I was working on the project. But before I start to be focused particularly on the topic of my presentation, I would like to share with you a small personal story. Before I came while I was still writing my PhD thesis, I secretly started an additional research on so-called labor camp for Jews in Sereď in Slovakia, which had become later the topic of my postdoctoral project. While I have been using different sources, among others, the sources of perpetrators, of Slovak and German side, documents of the Jewish Center, or so-called, or sort of Slovak version of Judenrat, materials from the post-war trials or memoirs, my main focus is on testimonies. The testimonies I have been studying are originated in 1980s, 1990s, but also in 2000s and the very recent ones. The testimonies I have seen or heard are collected usually in archives in Slovakia, Czech Republic, Poland, but also in Israel and USA. When I was doing this little rebellious research, the Museum of Holocaust on the area of the former camp in Sereď has been open. So since January 2016, the gates of the museum have been open, and I was very happy about this successful initiative. With opening of the museum, the Slovak public has received more and more information on the Holocaust in Slovakia, but mostly on the existence of the Sereď camp. The information were predominantly or have been predominantly spread via state or private television, radios, various newspapers, and of course internet. In 2016 I went to the museum, and unfortunately I was a little bit disappointed by the exhibition, but I'm not going to bore you about this. At the same time, I met a Holocaust survivor who was a former inmate of Sereď, who has also visited the museum and told me, among many other things, that he had to tell the staff of the museum, quote, "Do not make it worse than it was bad enough." This sentence made me wonder, and I have become more and more curious about the narrative of the Holocaust in Slovakia as executed by the museum in Sereď and presented to general public. I have realized that the museum tend to create a particular narrative which has not been always supported by the historical evidences, but it claimed to be based on testimonies. Today I will try to illustrate the danger of adopting the narratives of Holocaust survivors' testimonies while creating new narratives on example of a particular historical event. So the dot there is the location of the Sereď, and this is the second picture is the entrance of the Holocaust Museum. But before I start, as a youngish but still old-fashioned historian, I will try to share also some hard facts about the Sereď camp, so you can have an idea about what sort of camp we are talking about. Sereď, together with Nováky and Vyhne, was among the three main transit, labor and concentration centers and camps in Slovakia. The construction work started under the umbrella of the Slovak Ministry of Interior in September 1941 as a result of the Slovak anti-Semitic policy. The camp was built in the area of the former military storehouses, approximately 50 kilometers from Bratislava. I don't know what it is in miles. Between March and September 1942, during the so-called first phase of deportation from Slovakia, when altogether approximately more than 57,000 Jews were deported from Slovakia, 3 full transports, each train had 1,000 people, and 5 smaller transports carrying altogether 4,463 people departed directly from Sereď. There were 2 categories of people concentrated there: the inmates who would be deported and forced laborers. So from September 1942 on, the camp became a labor camp only. Until March 1944, the camp was guarded by a Hlinka guard. very simplified, let's say a Slovak version of SS or SA, later on by Slovak gendarmerie. The camp accommodated approximately 1,000 forced laborers, men, women and children of all ages. The camp had several workshops to produce, for example, furniture, hats and many others. There was a school, a kindergarten, a Jewish council and also Jewish police. The condition in the camp after the deportation in September 42 improved, but predominantly due to the bribery of the Jewish center. The members were also bribing the commander of the camp, Imrich Vasina. However, the inmates still lived under the prison-like regime, not mentioning all the persecution they went already through. Fast forward to August 1944, when the Slovak national uprising started. The camp gates were open and many people ran away, some joined partisans. However, already in September 1944, members of SS arrived to Sered and created a penal and detention camp. It was the only camp which was reopened in Slovakia after the uprising. In the last day of September 44, the infamous Alois Brunner arrived to the camp and organized deportation from Sered. From September 44 to March 45, 11 transports with approximately 11,500 people were deported from Sered to Auschwitz, Sachsenhausen, Bergen-Belsen and Theresienstadt. During this period, the non-Jewish prisoners were kept in Sered as well, and a rough number, approximately 44 people, were also killed in the camp. The camp was liberated by the Soviet army on April 1st, 1945. So now, when we have this basic information, I can develop my argument further, and I have decided to pick one single event from the history of the camp. In this case, the adaptation of the testimony does not try to show the events worse than they were, but more bombastic or more heroic. The event happened in the late August 1944, when the Slovak national uprising had started and the gates of the camps were opened. Short excursus: the Slovak national uprising was an armed insurrection organized by the Slovak resistance movement during the World War II. It was launched on August 29, 1944 from Banská Bystrica in an attempt to resist German troops that had occupied Slovak territory and to overthrow the government of Josef Tiso. Although the resistance was defeated by German forces, the partisan operation continued until the liberation of Slovakia. During the uprising, inmates of 3 main camps which I mentioned in Slovakia were freed and under different circumstances. The gates of Sered were opened as well on August 30, 1944, but there are various narratives about this event. And I will start with the claim of the director of the Holocaust Museum in Sered, which mentioned during the, let's say, documentary movie presented at the DA3, which is a Slovak version BBC, let's call it. It's a station which is showing only news. So he claimed, quote, "The guard from the commandant from gendarmerie was figuring out what to do with the Jews, to keep them or to let them go. So he called his superior and he had said him, keep the Jews. The army crew in Sered did not join the uprising, which means that the Sered gendarmerie unit fought against the partisans. One member of the Jewish underground in Sered took his pistol and said," quote this particular person, "either you give an order to open the gate or we will open it anyway." End of this quote. And the director of the museum continued, "Only then the commander gave the order to open the gate." End of the quote. So the director of the museum is probably speaking about Akiva Nir and trying to picture him as some sort of a hero or almost action figure. But this almost an urban legend is present in some testimonies of the survivors, but these survivors often said that it was a story they heard, but maybe it's not true, and they weren't there when it was happening. Anyway, then I looked at the testimony of Aki Vanir and also on his book, and I'm going to quote from his testimony. Beginning of the quote. I lived in Nitra with false papers. I came back to Seret armed with a revolver. I came to Pressburger, it was the head of the Judenrat in camp, and told him to open the gates, so they will not let us there for Germans. The Judenrat called the Gendarmerie guard. He was indeed a decent man, and he said, and now he is quoting the Gendarmerie guard, I will give you everything which the Gendarmerie has, all arms, so you can defend the camp. End of the quote of the Gendarmerie guard. And I'm continuing with the quoting Aki Vanir. We decided to get to know if the Seret army crew have decided to defend the town of Seret against German. If so, we would stay and we would try to defend camp. But they did not want to defend Seret. Therefore, we asked the commander of the camp to open it. The camp was open and many Jews left. This information, a very similar one, is also included in his book, but it's a little bit more elaborated with more details. This information was also published within the book of Jan Hlavinka and Eduard Nižnanský on Seret camp. I was not satisfied with this testimony yet, so I wanted to dig a little bit deeper to know more about this particular event. So I went to the regional archive in Bratislava, and I checked the diary of the Gendarmerie station in Seret, particularly from August 30, 1944. And this entry says, or we know from this entry, that the army crew in Trnava, nearby, there's not the map, but nearby Seret, did not want to be disarmed by Germans. So they decided to retreat to nearby Hlovec. The head of the regional Gendarmerie, originally seated in Trnava, also ordered the head of Seret Gendarmerie and head of Gendarmerie guards in camp to retreat and lead towards Hlovec. Due to the retreat of the Gendarmerie in charge of the camp, all Jewish prisoners kept in the camp were released. This document says very little or almost nothing on the debates between the Jewish prisoners and the Judenrat and the guards. But it is evident that the Gendarmerie and the army did not fight against the partisans, unlike the director of the museum claims, but joined them via army base in Hlovec. It was still not enough for me, so I went to the Slovak National Archive, and this archive owns a report on the control of actual status of the Jewish hospital in Seret and the labor camp in Seret. This control was carried by the Ministry of Interior together with a representative of the Jewish Center in Bratislava. The report says, apart from some exception, most of the patients of the hospital remained and the work of the hospital was not disturbed. The head of the Jewish council of the camp, Alexander Pressburger, remained in the camp with insignificant number of inmates. Apart from soldiers guarding the possessions of the camp, nobody was there. And the report follows the event of August 30, 1944, saying, quote, the guards of Gendarmerie got on the camp van with their arms, left the camp and announced to all camp inmates, quote, everybody who values life better escape the camp, end of this quote. And continuing, subsequently the Jews left the camp in a big panic and ran away to the surroundings, end of the quote. So we can see that not only the official document says very different story, but also the testimony of memoir of Aki Vanir, who's supposed to be the hero of the museum director. I have shown you that adaptation of knowledge from testimonies on an example of one event. I could continue with many others, and I'm sure that it's not adaptation. This sort of adaptation is not only in the case of Holocaust Museum in Seret. While following the testimonies and additional sources, we can identify such adaptation, and thus several reasons for forming the narrative and memory of this museum as claimed to be based on testimonies. Even though the motivation of such deeds of the museum director or museum staff are important, but what disturbs me more is the danger of creating such narratives and building a new memory of places such as Seret, and the tendency to adjust history according to some needs or private or public motivation. The more I was trying to figure out what is behind the adaptation of the testimonies, the more I'm convinced that either there is a major lack of knowledge among the staff of the museum, or there is a selective approach. They are not making up the stories, but they are choosing some of the stories from testimonies which are most bombastic, most violent, most heroic, most iconic. By doing so, they are failing to fact-check and thus often present incorrect information. So we can see that the museum, maybe with the best intention, it has also been diverting from the testimonies of the Holocaust survivors in order to adapt them according to their wishes or needs. To a major extent, this museum is not special with its adaptation of knowledge from historical sources, including testimonies, and it fits into the new paradigm of Holocaust memorialization, which is focusing on emotion instead of facts, masses instead of personalities, and German perpetrators instead of local ones. And while I do believe that the rethinking, analysis, and usage of different tools of examining testimonies of Holocaust survivors have helped to develop research not only on Holocaust studies, this overinterpreting, adjusting, or adapting the same testimonies, even for a good cause, could harm not only the scholarship, damage the public opinion, but also could serve as a very fertile soil for right-wing extremists, anti-Semites, racists, Holocaust deniers, and all modern believers in fake news. I would like to emphasize that the generation of survivors is unfortunately disappearing, and thus the importance and responsibility of scholars of Holocaust, curators, directors of museums, and memorials is way bigger. And therefore there is a constant need to absorb and stop those who decide to cherry-pick information from testimonies to create narratives which prove their arguments and visions, rather listen to them, contextualize them, and forward them further. As I was prepared for the discussion after my paper, I wanted to finish with 3 main questions. I'm going to ask it anyway, and feel free to come to me afterwards or write me email or whatever. So, my 3 questions related to the reasoning behind the misuse of the testimonies are: 1. First, if somebody is lacking the knowledge, why there is nobody correcting these dangerous creation narratives? 2. Why there is a need for bringing up stories which are the most violent, most sexualized, and most heroic? And 3. What is the politic behind such misuse of adaptation of history? And with these 3 questions, I would like to thank you for your attention.